Hello, and welcome to this session, Visioning the Invisible, the Traumatized Bodies of Racialized Cult Members and Survivors. I am going to jump right in. My name is Evvie Ormon. So to start, I'm just going to release that. I'm not going to be going through all the slides, so I'm going to release that expectation. And I'm also going to release the expectation that I'm going to say everything that needs to be said in this session. We have 50 minutes, and it's not very much time to talk about a topic as expansive as this. I did include lots of quotes in the slides, and there is a handout with all of the information on the slide, so I encourage you to take a moment and look at that before continuing to provide some context for the conversation that's going to happen. There's also in the handout a list of books where a lot of these quotes came from, and that's just sharing my lineage, the people that I've learned from, especially about racial trauma and racial justice and healing. And I do highly recommend those books for additional context on this conversation, because I'm going to be approaching this conversation with some assumptions about what you may or may not know. And just because I don't have time to build all that context in and still have the conversation that I want to have about our topic. So just to start, I am Evvie Ormon. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. And this is my bio. I am a second-generation cult survivor, and I am a facilitator, and I'm a somatic abolitionist. I encourage you to look into that, to look that up if it piques your curiosity. And professionally, I am a coach and a facilitator, and my history is working in mental health and higher education. I am bringing in Emergent Phoenix because that's the organization that I started to hold all the projects that I work on that are for trauma survivors, as well as for racial justice and healing for folks all over the globe. So I'm going to acknowledge that this is a very, very charged topic that we're going to be talking about today, racial trauma. It has a lot of energy and charge to it. And I like this quote because at the end, Erasmus says, if you don't build a container by which you are both contextualizing and holding that charge, the charge will blow apart the container that you've set. And I just want to acknowledge that I don't have the ability to create a container here today because this is not interactive. And so I encourage everyone who is listening and watching to take care of yourselves. There's absolutely no reason why you need to listen or watch this all the way through without pausing or taking breaks. And I encourage you not to do that, to take care of your nervous system and just to notice any activation that's coming up, and to take a break and come back to it when your nervous system has settled if you start noticing activation. And it would be surprising if you didn't. It has been very charged and activating for me to prepare. So I just want to make that acknowledgement so that folks can be reminded to take care of themselves. This is one of my favorite quotes. I'm not going to read it, but letting it come across the screen. So part of the reason that I'm talking about bodies is because of our lived experience in life as living in bodies, and that's how we're having this human experience on the earth. And that living is a visceral experience. And I think it's really easy to, and often is common in conversations about racial trauma, to get into an intellectual space and to talk about it from an intellectual standpoint. And moving on to the next slide, racism is not an intellectual experience. And it is an embodied visceral experience. It's not even a set of beliefs about people. And so when we experience that sensation of hierarchy and othering, it affects our nervous systems, it affects our physical bodies, it affects our ability to move through space, and it affects our material circumstances, and all of those are visceral experiences. So I'm going to jump right into some definitions. These are definitions of what I mean when I'm using these terms going forward, not necessarily the only definitions, but just so we have some shared context and shared vocabulary for the conversation going forward. So the definition that I'm primarily going to be leaning on today and framing the conversation is the definition of white body supremacy. And that is, in simple, it was a term coined by Resmaa Menakem in my grandmother's hands, in which the white body is elevated over all other bodies and is deemed the supreme standard against which all other bodies' humanity is measured, and anything outside of the white body, any body, is considered deviant from that standard. And that is in contrast to white supremacy, which is the term that probably anyone who's been a part of conversations about racial trauma and justice has heard before. And while this is a valid definition, it informs white body supremacy, this is not necessarily what I'm talking about today. So I have this here as reference. And this is another quote that I won't read, but I enjoy this quote because it really brings home that racism is a visceral experience, and that it impacts our bodies, that it causes injury, that it ends lives, and that it's not an intellectual experience, and the way we talk about it often is inadequate. Again, bringing in the racialized trauma aspect into the body. This is what I mean when I'm talking about racialized trauma in the conversation coming up. So I do want to mention that racialized trauma is not a flat experience. It is multidirectional and layered. It includes the individual, it includes the collective, and it includes complex trauma, which is trauma that happens repeatedly over many generations. And all of those are involved in the racial trauma experience, and it is involved in what I'll be talking about in our conversation. What I do want to name is that what I'm not saying in this conversation is that there's anything wrong or defective about people of color or about our bodies, or that something about, us having racialized trauma, which it's actually not just us. In a racialized society, everyone is assigned a racial identity. And so we all experience trauma from that. And so what I'm not saying is that any of our bodies are defective, or that the fact that we are carrying trauma in our bodies is defective. We've needed this trauma in order to survive. And so, it has been necessary, and it continues to be necessary, because we still experience racialized trauma, many of us, on a daily basis. So I want to make that clear that that's not what I'm saying. And I think it's really important to recognize that the idea of safe space, of a space that's completely safe for many of us, is not a realistic expectation, that we can create safer spaces, and we'll be talking about how we might do that. But the expectation that a space will be completely safe that's often not achievable. So before we transition into the rest of the session, I do just want to name that I chose this particular format to be accessible for my neurodivergence, because I was struggling with dissociating in the monologue format, and I wanted to take care of myself. And so I asked a friend to support me. What I do not want folks to take away from this is to go and approach people of color and to ask them to have a conversation like the one that you will witness. Was a lot of pre-work that went into this. There's a lot of trust that's been built. The person that is supporting me, we've known each other for years, and we've talked about racial trauma many times. There was a lot of questioned and consent negotiation that went into this. We agreed to the questions beforehand, and all of that pre-work isn't something that you're able to see. You're just seeing the final product. But I want to make it really clear, kind of as a disclaimer, like, please don't try this at home, because that approaching people of color, requesting education, asking lots of questions about our experience can be re-traumatizing, and it can be harmful, and it can feel exploitative. And so that is my disclaimer for what you're about to witness. And I am grateful for the support that I received, and I'm really grateful that we're able to have this conversation together today. So with that, we will move into conversation and dialogue with a friend. All right. Hi, Benjamin. Are you ready to get started?
Super ready.
All right. So I'm going to start by introducing myself with my social location. My name is Evvie, again, and I am Black. I am non-binary. I am working class. I'm neurodivergent and disabled. I am living in the same country where I was born, and I identify as queer. I am college educated, and I am a native English speaker.
Cool. My social location is I'm a Caucasian, European Caucasian. I'm cis male. I'm upper middle class, able-bodied, a natural-born U.S. citizen, bisexual. I have an undergraduate degree, and I'm fluent in the dominant language of my country.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to be having a conversation about basically about the traumatized bodies of cult survivors and why this feels like such an important thing to discuss. And my friend Benjamin is supporting me because I found this topic really challenging to talk about in a monologue, and stay in my body as a neurodivergent person and also as a survivor of trauma. So I'm really grateful for Benjamin for supporting me today.
Whoops, I was muted.
Yes.
That might happen again. Happy to be here.
Great. So I am open to just to get started with questions.
Cool. So to get us started off, and it's a big question, of course, but can you talk about your experience in cult recovery spaces so far and how race plays a part in that?
Yeah, thank you. So my first experience going into a cult survivor support space and family support space, first of all, my experience so far has been really positive. The thing that connects to race, though, is when I remember first logging into a virtual support meeting and looking at everybody who was there and having this moment of wondering whether or not I was welcome or whether or not the space was for me, because I didn't see anyone who looked like me. And because of the personality that I have, I was like, well, I'm gonna be here, even if that maybe wasn't the intention. But I recognize that many people of color have had that experience of walking into a space or entering a space and not seeing anyone who looks like them. And I think it's really natural in for anybody, not just for people of color, to enter and look around to see, am I supposed to be here? Am I welcome? Is this space for me? And when we don't see people who look like us, it leaves it as a question. And even if people within this space say that we're welcome and say that it's okay for us to be there, there's still an energy that comes with it, because there's some questions. It's like, why aren't other people who look like me? Did people who look like me not leave cults? Are people who look like me seeking support, like, is this okay for me to do? And it leaves me, even now that I'm thinking about it, I'm realizing I'm feeling like tension in my body, just remembering, because I have had other experiences in the cult that I was raised in, of walking into a room of, or to, into a congregation of people who were entirely white, and having a feeling of visceral rejection, and knowing that I wasn't welcome at all, of having that, the looks of people on their faces communicating to me, like, what are you doing here? Um, and so, because I have had that experience before, it really is jarring, anytime that happens. And I think that that's not something that's personal to me. It's probably something that is a historical trauma. And um, what I would love to see, and what I think is really important, is for cult recovery spaces to represent the people who actually have left these groups. And it's not, I don't think that right now they're representing, like, accurately representing the folks who have left, and also people who are seeking support. But that having them very homogenous, it can, it feels unwelcoming. And I think it is unwelcoming, in that there are things that, whether it's intentional or conscious or not, that create a space that makes it feel like this isn't created for me. And that maybe I'm allowed to be here with permission, but that's not the same energy of having a space where it's for me. And that's why I do feel, on some level, surprised, because I have seen other survivor support organizations, maybe not specifically for cult survivors, but for other kinds of trauma support, have dedicated spaces for Black and Indigenous people of color, so that we can talk about our experiences, and know that the experiences of race and gender and all other kinds of marginalization are okay to bring into a space, without having me having to, like, work up the courage to do so. And so I have been surprised that I haven't seen that in the cult recovery spaces. And I've asked questions, and most of the folks that I've asked have said, "You're right. I wonder why that's the case," and been open to been open or curious to know more.
You described a what I think you call a visceral feeling. Can you talk more on that, and how the topic of your presentation about bodies, just what that means for someone who might not be familiar, and maybe some of the history that goes into that dynamic?
Yeah. So our experience of being alive is a visceral experience. We are having an experience in our human bodies. And I can speak from my experience as somebody who's Black, and whose ancestors who have historically been enslaved and discriminated against in the U.S., that the trauma of viscerally being othered, because humans are such a social species, and we require belonging, like, our nervous systems need mirroring. I mean, that's part of why I'm doing this with you, is because it's actually easier and more settling for me to be talking to someone than for me to feel like I'm in isolation, kind of reliving these traumatic experiences, and nobody's hearing me, or witnessing me, and that I'm not getting some sort of acknowledgement of what I'm saying. And so Black people in the United States particularly haven't had that. And it's not just Black folks. It certainly is Indigenous peoples all over the world who have experienced being erased and continue to experience being erased, and many other people, like Black and brown people, regardless of whether they're in the United States and the West, we have had this visceral lived experience of being other, of the white body being considered the standard and everything else being considered a deviation. And even though the way the world population, the global majority, are people of color, even though that's true, that often for people, especially in Western countries or countries who have a history of being colonized, that's not our lived experience in our bodies. Our lived experience is of being, of needing, of wondering whether we are physically able to be in a space because it might not be safe. Like there were hundreds of years where that was, being in the wrong place could mean that death, you know. And so it's only really been in the last couple of generations that that's not the case. And because I inherit that trauma in my body, and then I've had my own experiences that reinforce that. How I experience is literally like my muscles constricting and tightening, or feeling a sense of hypervigilance and needing to look around and check to make sure that I'm safe, of looking for other people like me for reassurance that it's okay for me to be here and that it's safe. And I think particularly for survivors of authoritarian groups, we know what it's like to feel, whether or not we were conscious of the feeling in our bodies, like we know what it's like to feel excluded. Many of us have experienced being shunned if we left the groups that we were in. And sometimes those experiences are it's just an energetic experience. Maybe nobody told you that you're shunned, but when we've left and gone back into relationship with somebody that remains in the group, we feel that disconnection. And that isn't therapeutic. It's not healing. And ultimately, I think it's really sad because the experiences that people of color have had are human experiences. And it is part of the global experience of being a survivor of trauma, of authoritarian or coercive violence. And so if we're not creating spaces where people can share and talk about what has happened, and even talk about how they were recruited, we're missing a huge part of the story. And it also is leaving our ability to educate the public on the tactics that groups use to recruit people and who are already experiencing marginalization in the larger society. We're not able to properly educate everybody because we aren't hearing how did people who are part of the global majority get recruited into these groups? Like, what were the tactics that they were using? And it makes me sad to think that the whole picture isn't being represented, and that it leaves people of color and people of the global majority more vulnerable to groups like this, because we're not, or groups that are authoritarian and coercive and high demand, because we aren't seeing either ourselves represented when we leave. And so perhaps people feel like we need to go back, or before we encounter the groups, or while we're encountering these groups, to be able to know the red flags because we've heard about them from educational resources that places like ICSA and other survivor organizations are compiling to educate folks so that they can avoid these groups.
On the topic of the resources that are available, how does race play a part in the research that is and is not happening, and the kind of resources that are available as a result of that?
This is an activating topic for me, particularly because I am a very curious person, and I love education. And growing up as someone who was homeschooled and had so much information control, particularly, and the limited information that I had access to when I left the group, one of the things that I dreamed about was going into higher education and even getting a PhD. And what I experienced going into academia was a lot of racial discrimination. I won't get into like specific details, but essentially it was communicated to me repeatedly that I wasn't welcome, that it wasn't expected for me to be involved in education higher than a bachelor's degree. And there were things that were done to prevent me from going that far. And just out of love for myself, I decided to not subject myself to that ongoing emotional violence. And I experienced that as a student, and I also experienced that as an employee of a higher education institution. And so that is an experience that people of color have, whether or not they're survivors of cults. And so I would imagine it can make it really challenging to be involved in research of our own communities, which I think is really important, that we're not, what I don't want to advocate is for institutions to come in and extract the trauma and stories of cult survivors in order to gather data. I really think that people should be researching their own. We should be researching our own communities, and that with that, it should come with resources for support. And right now, that's not happening. And so I think there is a misrepresentation as far as both in like the cult expert space, if we look at who the people are who are considered experts in and cultic abuse, not to take anything away from them, but it's just like there's something that's missing. There are stories that are missing, and there are experts who aren't being recognized because of the access to either resources. You know, maybe we're not hearing about the stories of people who struggle because they're not. It's hard to make stories visible if people aren't present. But then in addition to that, you know, for people who are researching, if people of the global majority are not represented in higher education or in research, or are not in a part of the leadership in organizations that fund cultic research, then the things that get researched are not going to accurately represent the people who are experiencing cultic abuse, because it might not even be on the radar of the people who are making those decisions. And I know, and I think it's pretty common knowledge, that in a lot of Western countries, people of color already are marginalized as far as having access to resources. And so as a cult survivor, if you get out, for example, and you don't have access to education, and you didn't have access to education, and then you need to support yourself outside of the group without the social network that you had within the group, it can feel impossible. And it can lead to things like people feeling to mental illness, to people feeling so isolated that they don't feel like life is worth continuing, to physical and mental, physical illness, and not having access to healthcare because of not having adequate jobs. And so I think it can create a snowball effect, and I've personally experienced that, and I know that part of it is because of my experience being in a cult and like maybe not having the same social interaction that I would have had. So and knowing that, unfortunately, when I get out of a cult, the larger society doesn't care what my previous experience was. They don't care why it is that I haven't had access to education. I know that cult survivors and family members of people in cults do care, but I don't feel that in a tangible way, and I think that's why I feel so passionately about talking about this and being like, hey, there are gaps. Like, let's talk about how we can do better. Let's talk about why this is happening, and on some level, I think it's entirely possible for people in cult survivor space and cult expert spaces to set an example, and to to set an example for the larger societies that we're in, to say, like, it is possible to change this, and that we aren't going to make the resources that are available within our community only available to people based on their body designation, and that we are going to raise the voices and support folks who are on the margins, even within our own community.
A moment ago, you were talking about how the cult experience kind of preconditions you, and then like you go out into the world and people either don't know or don't care. Can you talk some more about how race overlaps with the cultic experience, and how the experience of a person of color in a cult or being recruited by a cult might be affected by those dynamics?
Yeah. So I think it might be helpful for me to just speak from my experience and my family. My parents were recruited into a group when they were in their late 20s, and my parents grew up. They were teenagers during the civil rights movement in the United States, and so they would have witnessed and experienced within their community both the rise of Black folks, of queer people of color, queer and trans people of color, basically saying, like, this is not okay for us to be excluded from both the wealth, the social acceptance, the status, that existed in the West and North America. And then to see that movement gain traction, and then to witness over what was essentially a period of 10 years, which in the grand scheme of things isn't very long, the murder of countless of it's like even talking about it, but of the people who were the heroes of their communities, people who are standing up and making making it hard to ignore that change was necessary. And so I could imagine my parents being in a place once they got to be, in their late 20s, and they're thinking about starting a family, and encountering this group who is like, we are racially mixed. We are going to provide lots of support as far as like childcare, as far as, social security, so that, if something happens that maybe is what you would typically experience in the outside world of like not having social capital and connections that would help you get a job to be able to support yourself, or needing just like the village, to support a family in the economic and social conditions that they were used to living in. For this group to say, like, we have that, not only do we have like social support, but we also have the answers to like what's right and wrong. So then you don't have to wonder about what are the answers to, like, how do you raise your kids morally and ethically, and, making decisions is easy because we'll tell you what's right and what's wrong. I could imagine like them encountering that and thinking like, this is the best thing for my family, because this is what, look at what we have to deal with in the rest of society. And so, I mean, this would have been in the 80s, like during the like crack epidemic era. And so it makes total sense to me why my parents thought joining the group that I was born and raised in, which ended up being incredibly racist, that ended up being very authoritarian and abusive and really like tearing our family apart eventually. You know, I could see the introduction being something that was very appealing to them. And I have the benefit of retrospect of having been raised in the group. And so I know what the impact of like that black and white thinking is. But my parents didn't have that. And so it makes me really sad because on some level, I think they did feel like they were doing something that was good for us and raising us in this group. And it wasn't just, you know, me. There were hundreds of, probably thousands of other kids like me raised in groups like this, and other kids of color being raised in this group. And but what ended up happening is we were isolated from society. And so when it came to me getting an education and wanting to leave and kind of go live in the larger world, I wasn't prepared for what I was going to encounter. And unfortunately, a lot of these groups, that's what they do, is they isolate people and kind of control every aspect of your life so that there's not, you don't have the ability to survive in the external world. And then the other thing that I had to deal with is that some of the things that I was taught in the group about, or especially from my parents, about the way the outside world is hostile and violent and rejecting. I hear a lot of cult survivors that are not people of color say that all of that wasn't true. Like when they left, they were like, people were so welcoming, they helped me, you know, I received all this support. And to be honest, that wasn't my experience. I have struggled. And I found that, you know, sharing the experience of being in a cult even isn't something that elicits sympathy from people, because they kind of just assign that whatever dysfunction to like probably to my parents being black people and like being you know, the assumption of them being uneducated or not wanting what was best for me. And another sad thing is that institutions in the West have historically separated families of color and destroyed families of color for hundreds of years. And so it's not just cults that have done that, it's also been the government and other institutions. And so this is one more experience on top of all that other stuff. And so when I got out of the group, the truth is that sometimes there are some days that life has actually been much more difficult. And I've experienced what feels like punishment for leaving, even though I know that it wasn't wrong for me to leave. And I think that's a really different experience than I've heard talked about, at least from the cult survivor stories that I've been able to access. And so even that can feel alienating, to not have heard stories of people who are like me, who get out and they're like, everything I was taught about the world wasn't wrong. Some of it was true. And I have struggled and I have experienced rejection and violence and discrimination. And it's not all, you know, like not everyone has been supportive and helpful. I have received a lot of support and love, and I appreciate it when I come across that. I also kind of feel like it's been the exception and not the rule since I left. And sometimes I think, at least for my family, it has given them reason to even doubt whether me leaving was good. Like it's been, I think it's even hard for like my siblings to have seen me struggling to think, well, why should they leave? Like, at least in the group, we have these other things. Maybe they do control all of, you know, our lives, and maybe they do prevent us from being in our full humanity. But if we get all these benefits that we don't get and we don't have access to from institutions or from the larger society, then why should I leave? And that's actually a valid thing to consider.
Makes a lot of sense. So that feels like a good segue to start talking about how things could change, how things could be better. What are can you speak more to your vision of what can come next in when it comes to this dynamic, and how you might like to play a part in that yourself?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So for me, one of the things that feels really important to name is that, and I did briefly mention this before, but I think it's so important that cult survivors of color have agency over how our stories are told. And that they're not, that there are not institutions that are coming from a lens that isn't our lens, coming in and representing, or perhaps often misrepresenting our experiences or extracting. One of the things I've learned kind of in the larger activist movement for racial justice is that there is an expectation for people of color to do labor without being paid, without being compensated, and to have this kind of trauma porn of 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 suffering that we experience used as far as like fundraising. And I don't like, that's not, first of all, that's exploitative, and it is a part of the oppressive system. And I don't think it's necessary, honestly. It I think that, at least for me, what I would love to see and to be a part of are people of color being able to find each other within cult survivor and movements, for people who have been in cultic groups and have left to be supported by the community of other survivors and researchers, to tell our stories, to research our own community's experiences, and to gather those stories, to have them be published, so that when people who are in these groups are looking for literature and stories, that they can see stories of people like themselves who have left and who are giving back to the community, who are thriving, so that it feels possible to leave. And then I also feel like it's really important for people like me who I have so much to contribute, and I do want to, I have a desire to contribute to people who have had experiences like the experiences that I've had, because I understand what it's like, to be able to be, and being careful not to say like being given permission, because that there's layers to that can feel oppressive too. But yeah, for folks who are already in the cult expert space, for folks who are already in the cult survivor and support space, to open the door to cult survivors of color who have, I mean, we have this is embodied wisdom that we're bringing, not only from our cultic experience, but just from our experience of being alive on the earth in the bodies that we're in. There's a lot of wisdom, a lot of historical wisdom, a lot of ancestral wisdom that we bring, of like, how do you survive trauma and horrific circumstances? Because we've been doing that for hundreds of years and been thriving and been creating. And I don't think that that's not an extreme thing to say. I think it's pretty clear, especially in the U.S., that Black folks in particular have found been able to create our own culture, beauty, recreate norms of what is family, even though our families have been being torn apart. And all of those things are things that the cult survivor community could benefit from. And so in some ways, I'm like, this it's is probably hampering the ability for the cult survivor community to grow and thrive in the ways that it could, by excluding, whether or not it's intentional, as I don't honestly think that it's intentional. I think this is part of a problem in our larger culture, and that it's just being replicated in our community. But what I would love to see is having those doors open, and for the support, for the expansion, for the research and the funding, frankly, to do all of those things, because that is what is required in order to do research. There has to be sponsorship, for that to be there, and for it not to be expected for people of color to continue to give the labor without compensation and without support, in a way that allows us to have lives where we can thrive, and where we can be examples to folks who are either perhaps being recruited into these groups or who want to leave, to say that there is a life for them outside of these groups. So, I mean, I would personally love to be able to show that to my family and siblings, and I know that I'm not the only one. So that feels like the important thing. And I know a lot of research for cult survivors isn't even necessarily done through like higher education institutions, that it's being done through alternative means. And I think there are lots of creative ways that this can happen. And it doesn't have to necessarily be through institutions of higher education, that it could be grassroots movements. And I think right now, particularly just because of the conditions that we're living in with a global pandemic, to have virtual spaces where people of color from different regions can gather and be able to find shared reality in a safer spaces with each other is really, really important. And that's not happening. And I would love to see it happen. And I would love to even be a part of a team of people who are doing that. But because of the historical precedent of particularly Black people who are assigned female at birth being expected to give our labor, and especially emotional labor, without being compensated, I've just committed to myself that I won't do that without compensation of some kind, because it will deplete me, and then I won't actually be available for myself or for my community in a sustainable way.
Can you speak more on how anyone who's watching who agrees and who's like, yes, that sounds great, what can people do? And also, can you talk a little bit more about your vision for what those resources would look like?
Yeah. So my intention today really is to open up a conversation. I don't know what it would look like. I think it's something that we haven't seen before. And so it can be challenging to imagine what a better future could look like if it's not something that we've witnessed. But I do know that it's possible. And I know that it's possible, especially if folks collaborate and work together. So for me, the place to begin, if folks are hearing what I'm saying and they're like, how can they support me? If you're a person of color and you are interested in doing this work, I would love, part of my frustration with even doing this presentation was that I looked for other people of color who are cult survivors to talk to gather stories, and I couldn't find anybody. And that was really discouraging for me, because I was like, I know I'm not the only one, but why is it so hard for us to locate each other? And so folks can reach out to me through Emergent Phoenix, or throughout the conference. And For, you know, the rest, as far as like a vision of what is possible, I mean, I feel like the sky is the limit with that. I mean, humans are an incredibly adaptable and inventive species, and it seems like anything we imagine, we're able to make it happen. And so for me, I think, I have felt personally like challenged because of feeling like I would need to start something alone or to have to do it by myself. And that's not, both because of my experience of like like the cultic experience where people are being raised up in a way that isn't healthy. I don't want that for myself. I don't want that pressure. And I also know that it's not the best way to support community, that collective wisdom and collective input and collective, really just the collaboration aspect is really necessary. So folks can reach out to me through Emergent Phoenix or throughout the time the conference is posted. And I think, if there are organizations that support cult survivors and who want to figure out like how to broaden and accurately represent people who are survivors, to invite people of color like myself in as experts, as subject matter experts, as voices, support our stories being told, and support our stories being told by us, and to be open to creating and having co-created spaces where we can have, groups of ourselves together. It doesn't mean that we need to always be separate, but it is really nice to have a space where we can just relax and talk about our experience of being racially discriminated against and our racial trauma in the context of being cult survivors. Because right now there isn't really that I have not encountered any space for that. And I think once that begins to happen, what is possible will emerge, from the gathering of people and the collaboration that happens.
Awesome. Are there any points you feel like we haven't hit on that you want to make sure to include before we end?
No, I feel like we have covered what needs to be covered. Of course, this is a huge conversation, so I'm not saying we've exhausted it. But as far as what we have time to cover today and what I felt like was important to say, no. And I do intend to continue to have to expand this conversation, and to, within the next few weeks to even host more conversations for folks to gather and create space for people to come together and be like, what can we do, so that there is at least a place, and a time that we can gather once or twice. And then after that, we'll see. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you.